Hmm. You may wonder, why should I listen to yet one more voice on the topic of nutrition? Everybody's been talking about it. There are so many conflicting and confusing bits of information. Why should you listen to one more voice? I'll tell you why. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and my background, and then I want to talk about you. My name is Cheri White. I worked as a registered dietitian for 32 years in healthcare. I then got my health coach certificate from the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, and that pretty much just changed my world. The leader of it said, plan to be fitting out now because you'll no longer be fitting in, and boy has that been the truth. I learned all kinds of stuff I never learned as a registered dietitian. I learned about how industry uses their lobbyists to influence policy, and policy changes food guidelines, and food guidelines that have been changed alter the course of human health so dramatically during the course of my career. I learned all that stuff, and I could not work any longer in standard healthcare. I did not believe in the things that I needed to talk about anymore. I just couldn't in good faith continue doing that. And that was at great financial peril to me to make that change. I left a job that paid me $35 an hour to stop and work on building my own business and trying to preach this to people so I could help as many people as I possibly can. So if I left a job that paid me $35 an hour, I must feel pretty strongly about what I have to say. My background also is that I chose nutrition for very idealistic reasons. I'm not here to scam you. I want to help people. I didn't feel like I could help them within the framework of regular health care. The things I learned when I was finishing school, we didn't even talk about obesity. It was kind of a non-issue at the time. It was just starting to be an issue, but it was not a major focus of my study. We were talking about the aging baby boomers and what was going to happen to them when they aged out to the healthcare system, Medicare, Medicaid, particularly Medicare. My first job, my boss thought it would be a great idea, a great experience for me to go on live television. So she gave me that job. Thank you, Mrs. Wardrum. I went on live TV and I was introduced as an expert on childhood obesity. Well, I was an expert in nothing in my first job, and it surely wasn't on childhood obesity because we hadn't studied it. There are CDC maps, search that on the internet, Center for Disease Control maps, that show from 1985, when I was finishing college, to 2010, and there are subsequent ones that show up to 2019. And it's color-coded, and when you first start out in 85, most of the states are white, which meant there was not a lot of data because obesity was a non-issue. And you watch the colors get darker and darker, and then start on new color categories and get to darker and darker versions, and on and on. What happened in that 25 years during my career? What happened? There has been an explosion in the rate of obesity. There has been an explosion in the rates of diabetes and cancer and just endless, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's, food allergies. For most of my career, I never heard anything about food allergies. And then later on, way later on, it seemed like everybody had them. What was put into our food? That's quite an in-depth story. But the food supply in our country changed drastically during my career. In '77, the food guidelines were put out by the USDA nutritionists, and they were very sound. But this is the first time that they started talking about having to cut back because we were seeing more chronic disease. The guidelines prior to that were mainly about making sure that Americans got enough food. During World War II, it was a hazard for security reasons for our country. We had a hard time supplying enough soldiers because so many of them were malnourished and underweight. And ironically and sadly, now we're having trouble getting enough recruits because the rates of obesity and their complications are so high. That's tragic. It's tragic that I've worked with 3-year-old children with old age diseases. I worked with a 3-year-old who was pre-diabetic, morbidly obese, had high blood pressure and high cholesterol. The family was desperate to know what they were supposed to do to make this better. People don't even know what has happened to our food supply. Agriculture was deregulated in the 70s. We had been dealing with world famine, and we increased production, and that was turned around in 1 year. But we kept producing food at the same rate. Well, we now had more supply than demand, and we still had to be profitable. So that's when we first started seeing high fructose corn syrup. We've heard a lot about that. That's when we started seeing supersizing of portions. Food was much cheaper. People could eat out more. More women were in the workforce, and marketing was aimed towards convenience, so that to promote, going through the drive-through or picking up packaged foods. So food industries did not like it in '77 when we were saying eat less of this to deal with disease issues that were arising. They spent lots of money on lobbyists, and the lobbyists got those recommendations watered down significantly. Also, at that time, recently, I think it was 2014, a bunch of memos and information about the sugar industry came out. There was never firm research, solid research that showed that saturated fat and cholesterol affected heart disease, but there was plenty of information about sugar and inflammation and the diseases that it would affect. Well, the sugar industry paid the Harvard researchers to do research that favorably showed sugar as a non-culprit, and to make fat, saturated fat, cholesterol the culprit in these diseases we were seeing more of. And that was back before you had to say who funded your research. And this research went into the New England Journal of Medicine, which is prominent, and it became law at that point. This information formed the backbone of the new recommendations. Everything was watered down. That was the beginning of the low-fat era. And when you take fat out of food, you change the qualities of the food, the taste of it, the mouthfeel. It's not as good. So you got to add other stuff. Well, all this high fructose corn syrup was available, and that started getting dumped in all the food. People didn't know this. They didn't know it. So things that were sweet, like pop, got sweeter. Things that were not originally sweet, like soups and fast food, added it to their meats. And this sugar source was addictive, and also, there's nothing wrong with fructose in fruit. Fruit is good for you. It's got lots of good stuff, fiber, antioxidants, etc. But when you have a concentrated source, high fructose, fructose is not used for energy. It goes directly as fat storage. So it was still a regular sugar, so it raised blood sugar levels. Blood sugar levels are raised, insulin's raised. When that happens, you bottom out, you crave more, and you go back and have some more of what you had. It's a cycle of addiction. So all this stuff, including lots of seasoning, hyper-seasoned food to excite our palates. It was addictive. They even did brain scans as part of their work in learning how much they needed to put into foods to excite people's pleasure center in their brain so they'd come back for more and more, which is great for profit, but it was devastating for American health. During this time, you see rates of obesity going up like this. Obesity is an inflammatory condition, and you see the rates of chronic disease going up right alongside of it. All this inflammation from enhanced sugar intake has been devastating. I tried to use this information in one of my last jobs to talk to a diabetic about trying a lower sugar version of a jarred tomato sauce, or preferably making her own if she was able. And there was a dietitian with me, and she stood over the both of us and said, you can have all carbohydrates. They're all the same, they all fit in, because that's what the American Diabetes Association promotes. Well, all that added sugar, look what's happened in our nation. So I had to answer to 3 levels of management to say, why did you talk about sugar separate from carbohydrates? Well, because it's what's been the devastating force in our nation, and that was me fitting out. I didn't fit in anymore. So I was reprimanded for saying that. Well, there's a lot of things I could say, and it's on my website and in my video program. There's far more about that. So I'll just leave that there. So, golly, these rates of obesity and disease increased in children, adults. Do you think if you found that someone had added something to your child's food supply, you found it out, you actually knew it, you'd ask for some accountability, some retribution perhaps? Somebody should pay for it, be punished for it? We didn't know it. We didn't know all this was happening and how we were becoming addicted. And then that's why that family of the 3-year-old with all those issues, they were desperate to know, because they thought they were, doing the right thing. Well, people just don't realize. And with our food supply being addictive, you think that maybe influences other issues of addiction in our life? Yes, it does. So another thing that happened is home ec was taken out of schools, most schools in the 80s. Again, 2 people, the mother was working in most homes. There was less cooking going on, less teaching going on. People have lost the skills to cook. So people just really don't know what to do anymore to get themselves healthy. Well, the answer to most of life's ills, I promise you, is using whole food. Vote with your dollars, with your grocery dollars. Buy whole food. Do not buy the processed food. You will have to go through a period of withdrawal like you would from another drug. And during that time, allow yourself to be angry about what happened to our food supply and what's happened to our health. But after a period of, say, 2 weeks, your taste buds will change. You will favor whole, natural food the way that God made it. This sounds like a simplified answer. I went to 5 years of college, including my internship. I went to Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. I worked for 32 years in healthcare. I often would marvel that I had a profession that paid me so well, just teaching people how to eat. People don't know how to eat, shop, cook anymore to keep themselves healthy. And so much of moods, skin issues, diseases that your doctor may be saying, why aren't you controlling your diabetes? Why can't you lose weight? It's a matter of addiction now. It's not a matter of willpower.